Have you ever felt like you lost a debate, even when you had all the sharpest arguments? What if I told you that true power in any conversation doesn't come from what you say, but from what you don't say? Silence is the secret weapon that few dare to use, yet it can help you win even when you don't utter a single word. In today's video, I'm about to reveal a strategy that even Denzel Washington uses to always stay on top in any confrontation. Stick around until the end, and you'll discover why silence holds such immense power and how you can use it to take control of any situation. Are you ready to uncover the hidden strength of silence? Silence is a mysterious language that few of us dare to confront. It is not the absence of words or an empty moment, but a subtle weapon that only those brave enough can wield. Have you ever wondered why, in a heated debate, when everyone is speaking, you still feel like you can't win even though you've presented sharp arguments and convincing evidence? Have you ever experienced that sense of losing even though you weren't the weaker party? That's when silence begins to speak. We often get caught up in countless arguments in life, where the goal isn't to seek the truth, but to seize power. Every word, every rebuttal is an attempt to preserve one's image in the eyes of others, to assert the ego, to feel valuable, to feel powerful. But in reality, the moment you feel the need to justify yourself, the moment you try to explain and prove that you are right, you enter a game you will always lose. Because at that very moment, you have stepped into someone else's trap, allowing them to control the conversation, pulling you into an unnecessary battle, just to reinforce their own ego. Silence is not surrender or giving up. It is absolute self-control, a sign of a strong soul, one that doesn't need to prove anything. A truly strong person doesn't need to shout to assert their presence, doesn't need to argue to defend themselves. They understand that their silence speaks volumes. Silence in a debate isn't a lack of response, it is a powerful presence. It leaves the other person confused, questioning whether they are right, wondering if they've hurt you. This is the latent power that few dare to harness. In this world, we have been taught that argument is a way to defend ourselves and assert our personal power. But have you ever wondered why a debate becomes a battle, a contest to prove who is right and who is wrong? Are we caught in the whirlwind of ego and self-assertion? Every time you open your mouth to justify yourself, every time you feel the need to prove something, you fall into the trap of judgment and criticism. Silence, on the other hand, avoids that trap. Silence is not submission or surrender to anyone, but a way to rise above the constraints of meaningless arguments. We must understand that arguing is not a tool to seek the truth. It is merely a means to vie for power. Every argument is a game of ego, where each person strives to protect their beliefs and stance at any cost. And the moment you feel the need to justify your point of view, you've already stepped into that game without even realizing it. Meanwhile, silence is the perfect strategy, a strategy that cannot be broken by any attack. When you remain silent, you not only refuse to engage in the battle, but you also create a space of stillness for yourself to observe and gain a deeper understanding of your opponent. Silence is not submission, but rather an act of intellectual observation. When you stay silent, you force the other person to face themselves. They begin to wonder why you're not reacting, why you're not participating in their conversation. And during this process, they start to lose confidence, questioning themselves, their own ego. Silence doesn't need to speak to prove its power. It simply needs to exist, making others confront their own vulnerabilities. Every word, every reaction you have is a sign of your need for recognition, while silence is a sign of self-mastery and inner strength. You might think that in this world, silence can cause you to be overlooked, to be treated as weak, as someone without a voice. But in reality, in those moments of silence, you possess a power stronger than any words. Silence is how you reclaim control, refusing to be influenced by debates or the approval of others. You don't need to rebut to prove you're right. You only need to remain silent for the other person to realize their inability to affect you. Think of a moment in your life when you didn't need to say a single word to earn respect, when you didn't react to provocation, when you didn't engage in a meaningless argument. Your silence spoke volumes. You don't need to demonstrate your intelligence or power through eloquent speeches. Your silence is powerful enough to make the other person reflect on themselves, deep enough to make them feel the undeniable pressure. And this is the key to winning in life. Silence is not surrender or failure. It is absolute strength, a victory you don't need to say a word to achieve. Every time you remain silent, you show that you don't need to rely on words to prove your worth. Your silence is the strongest message, confirming that you have transcended the need for external validation. And that is when you truly possess an unassailable power. Silence is an art, a weapon you must learn to wield. It is the power of a soul that has been tempered, of a person who doesn't need to justify their existence. Silence is victory. It is power that doesn't need to be displayed. It is in silence that you will find yourself, and it is at that moment that others will realize they can no longer affect you. There is a concept that few truly understand and accept, that of the Übermensch or Superman, according to Nietzsche's philosophy. It is not the image of a heroic figure filled with strength, nor someone who surpasses all limits in a loud, flashy way. The Superman does not need to struggle, does not need to prove themselves in every argument, and does not need to speak up to defend their ego. What makes the Superman great is their ability to control themselves absolutely and to use silence as a powerful weapon, a tool of domination without uttering a single word. We often think power lies in debates, in winning with words, in proving who is right and who is wrong. But in reality, silence is a hidden power that not everyone recognizes. When you understand silence, you have grasped an absolute power that nothing can shake. People often get caught in the endless whirlpool of arguments, as though we must explain everything, defend ourselves piece by piece. But the silence of the Superman is not avoidance. It is a strong affirmation of inner self-mastery. It makes the opponent feel disoriented, unable to guess what you're thinking, unable to know how you will react. And in that surprise, they have already lost to you. Imagine you're standing in the middle of a crowd, surrounded by people trying to argue with you, attacking your views. While they rush to express their opinions, while they try every way to prove their correctness, you simply stand there, saying nothing, looking at them with a calm gaze. What happens? They will certainly feel uneasy. They will feel that they cannot reach you. They begin to wonder whether you're judging them, whether you're seeing through them. And in that moment of silence, your silence speaks volumes. You do not need to justify yourself. You do not need to argue to defend yourself. You only need to stand firm. And your silence creates an invisible wall that no one can break through. Silence, in Nietzsche's philosophy, is a sign of power. It is not passivity, not surrender, but the active control of oneself and the situation. Ordinary people will easily react, immediately speaking out when provoked when attacked. But the Superman is different. They do not react based on emotions or according to what others expect. Their silence is an expression of absolute self-control, unaffected by what is happening around them. When you can maintain silence in tense situations, you not only control yourself, but you also cause others to experience unease, forcing them to confront themselves. In everyday life, we are easily swept into meaningless arguments. We think that if we don't respond, if we don't explain clearly, others will think we are weak, that we are not capable of defending our views. But silence is strength, not weakness. When you remain silent, you're not giving up or yielding. You're showing others that you do not need to engage in a debate to feel valuable. You know that even in silence, you are winning. Silence causes your opponent to feel confused, to search for reasons why you're not reacting, why you're not participating in their game. And when they cannot find an answer, they will ask themselves whether they truly understand you. The silence of the Superman is not just a defensive weapon. It is also a method of attack. It is not about ignoring, accepting, or agreeing with what the other person is saying. It is a silent rejection a way to make the other person face things they do not want to see. When you remain silent, you do not need to attack others with words, yet your silence attacks their pride, their arrogance. They begin to feel insecure, and this exposes the very weakness they wish to hide. Silence is a test of patience, of confidence, and of one's ego. When you stay silent, you not only preserve your strength, but you also force the other person to reflect on themselves. Why does silence hold such power? It is because it doesn't need to explain, it doesn't need to justify. Silence is the acknowledgement that you do not need to do anything to prove that you hold power. The silence of the Superman is not the absence of words, but a clear affirmation that you are not controlled by what others expect of you. It is a declaration that you do not need to speak to prove your worth, because your silence does that for you. The Superman is someone who not only transcends the limits of conventional morality, but also overcomes the very limits of their own ego. They're not swept up in the emotions or spontaneous reactions that others around them often display. Their silence is evidence of absolute self-control, a power that does not need to be displayed in order to be acknowledged. And when you understand the power of silence, you will no longer feel the need to prove anything to anyone. You will understand that true power does not come from arguing or persuading others, but from maintaining your silence when those around you lose control. Remember, in this life, the silence of the Superman is not weakness or defeat. It is absolute strength, inviolable self-control, and victory before the battle even begins. And when you learn to use silence as a weapon, you will realize that you do not need to say a word to become the strongest person in any conversation. Silence is an invisible strength, and because of this, it can make others feel uneasy, even fearful. Have you ever wondered why silence can make your opponent so uncomfortable? They don't just feel ignored. Sometimes, silence causes them to spiral into anxiety, self-doubt. That's because, in silence, they can no longer hide their own insecurities. When there is no response or word from you, they're forced to confront themselves, to face the weaknesses and the falsehoods they've been trying to conceal. And at that moment, your silence becomes an invisible blade, cutting through the layers they've built to protect themselves. Imagine a conversation where you do not need to argue, where you do not need to offer justifications or defend your point of view. When you remain silent, you are not just refusing to respond to provocation. You are creating a gap, a space where the other person must reevaluate themselves. Every word they speak, every argument they present, will lack agreement, will lack a response from you. And it is this absence that causes them to lose control. Because when there is no reaction from you, they cannot guess what you are thinking, they cannot know whether you are judging them, evaluating them, or not. And this makes them uneasy. Silence is a challenge for those who cannot face themselves. They cannot bear the feeling of being seen through, of being judged without any explanation. And when you remain silent, you don't just make them feel like they've lost control. You also force them to confront truths they have been avoiding. When they speak, they may be hiding something about themselves, a truth they don't want others to know. But in the moment of your silence, they feel as if they're being scrutinized. They begin to wonder, do you see their weakness? Do you recognize the flaws they've been trying to conceal? Silence, to some extent, acts as a mirror. It doesn't need to speak to reveal the hypocrisy of others. Its mere presence does that. For those who lack confidence, silence becomes a silent accusation. It forces them to reevaluate themselves, to face the truth they've been trying to hide. And the longer you stay silent, the more tense and uncomfortable they become. Because silence is not just the absence of sound. It is a presence filled with power, a challenge they cannot ignore. When you remain silent, you don't just create a space of stillness. You also generate an invisible force that makes the other person feel like they are in a wordless battle. Silence is exposure. It forces others to face themselves, to confront the things they do not want to see. They begin to feel anxious, nervous, because they can't find any reaction from you. They don't know whether they are being judged, whether they are being criticized. And in that moment, they lose the confidence they once had. They feel weak and vulnerable. What frightens people the most is not the absence of words, but the absence of any response, the lack of opposition. When they speak, they hope you'll react, they hope you'll agree, or at least offer a counterpoint. But when you maintain silence, you refuse to play their game, you neither agree nor oppose, and this makes them feel as though they're losing control. They begin to doubt themselves, questioning whether they are truly right, whether they have made you uncomfortable. And in this moment, silence becomes an invisible weapon, cutting through all the defenses they've built. The interesting thing is, when you remain silent, you don't just make the other person uneasy, you also force them to reevaluate their own worth. Because, as Nietzsche said, a person's silence is not an absence, but a strong affirmation of presence. When you do not react, when you do not engage in the conversation, you're showing that you do not need to speak to assert your value. And this forces others to face the emptiness within themselves. Silence possesses a strange power. It doesn't need to be spoken to make an impression. It only needs to exist to influence others. Because of this, when you remain silent, you don't just make the other person feel insecure. You also make them reassess everything they've just said. They begin to feel the insecurity in their own words, because in your silence, they cannot be sure if what they said was truly right, or if they could persuade you at all. And in that moment, silence cuts through every layer they've created to hide their insecurities, deceit, and contradictions in their words. That is the power of silence. It doesn't just make others feel out of control. It forces them to confront the very weaknesses, the falsehoods they've been trying to keep hidden all this time. It strikes where no one sees, yet everyone feels. And that is why silence holds such immense power. Silence is not merely the absence of sound or speech. It is a strategic weapon full of power, a tool that few can wield with true mastery. If you understand how to harness silence, you'll discover that it is the key to gaining the upper hand in situations that seem impossible to win. Just like in combat, a warrior doesn't only know how to strike hard, but also when to stop, when to remain silent to create surprise and leave the opponent vulnerable. And when used correctly, silence can become the most powerful weapon in this strategy. One of the first weapons of silence is when you feel provoked, when you are forced to react. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone deliberately pulls you into an argument, knowing full well that there is no way you can win if you continue to engage in that verbal battle? In moments like these, silence is the strongest retaliation you can make. By staying silent, you not only refuse to be dragged into the conversation, but you also create a quiet space filled with power, forcing the other person to question why you aren't responding. This will make them uncomfortable because they cannot continue the battle without your feedback. Your silence becomes a subtle challenge, making them face their own insecurities and their need for validation. But silence is not just a tool for non-reaction. Another powerful weapon of silence is the ability to observe. When you remain silent, you not only hold back your words, but you also gain the opportunity to understand the other person more deeply. In every conversation, in every debate, there is much that is left unsaid, but is revealed through actions, glances, and gestures. When you remain silent, you can easily detect the instability in their attitude, the weaknesses they're trying to conceal. This creates a tremendous advantage because when you observe and understand your opponent, you can control the situation without saying a word. Silence also has another terrifying ability: time. Prolonged silence in a tense situation can create a pressure stronger than any spoken word. When you remain silent longer than the other person expects, you are creating an uncomfortable tension in the air. Each passing moment in that silence will make the other person feel out of control. They begin to think that you have a plan they cannot predict, and this makes them lose confidence. While they're constantly trying to figure you out, the inner tension within them steadily increases, and at that moment, you take control. Silence doesn't need to directly touch the opponent, but its duration makes them feel uneasy, and they start wondering if they are facing a silent warrior they cannot comprehend. An important factor that makes silence such a powerful weapon is its unpredictability. When you master silence, you become difficult to read. People fear what they cannot predict, and silence is the tool that creates this unpredictability. When you don't react immediately, when you don't follow what the other person expects, you create an unfamiliar and uncomfortable state. Others will start to feel uncertain about you. They won't know what you're thinking or what you'll do next. This creates an invisible form of control that doesn't require any words from you. Every word you speak could be misinterpreted, but silence is never misunderstood. You become the center of the conversation without having to engage too eagerly. People will start asking themselves, are you controlling this game? Are you judging them in your silence? And in that moment, they will grow cautious, and they themselves will make the mistake of trying to break your silence. Ultimately, silence is not only a defensive weapon, but also a powerful offensive one. While others are trying to prove their points, attacking you with words and reactions, you hold your silence. You don't need to participate in their game, don't need to fight them with words. When you remain silent, you've already won before the conversation even starts. Your silence is not surrender. It is a proactive strategy, forcing the other person to deal with the absence of a response. They will have to face the feelings of helplessness and confusion as they cannot predict what you'll do next. In life, we often get caught up in meaningless debates, in relationships where everyone tries to prove they are right. But if you understand and apply silence as a strategic weapon, you will realize that sometimes the debate is not what decides the outcome. Silence is the powerful tool that gives you the upper hand. When you master silence, you will understand that true victory doesn't come from words, but from the ability to hold silence with immense power. By now, you likely understand the power of silence. Silence can be a mighty weapon, but it can also be a deceptive trap. Have you ever wondered if sometimes you've fallen into a type of silence that wasn't your choice? A silence not born of strength, but out of fear, anxiety, or simply because you didn't want to disturb others. This is the type of silence many of us have experienced, yet not everyone realizes that it is stealing our power, weakening us day by day without our knowledge. When you remain silent out of fear of conflict or to avoid disrupting the peace, you're not only giving up your right to speak, but you're losing yourself. And at that moment, silence becomes surrender, not self-control or strength, but submission, a sign of fear from which you cannot escape. We often think of silence as a way to avoid conflict, to maintain harmony, to avoid hurting anyone, or to sidestep uncomfortable situations. But have you ever realized that in those moments when you remain silent for these reasons, you're actually agreeing to things you don't want? You are conceding, even letting others take control of your life. When you stay silent out of fear of criticism or concern that things will get more complicated, you are accepting weakness, not resilience. This silence is not a free choice. It is an escape from yourself, a surrender to the expectations and demands of others. You have unwittingly allowed yourself to become part of a vicious cycle where you have no voice, no real presence, only a silent shadow living according to what others desire. There is a hard truth to face. When you remain silent out of submission, you're not only conceding in a specific situation, but you're slowly losing control over your own life. You're no longer yourself. You become a shadow of what others want you to be. That silence gradually invades your soul, making you fade into the background, invisible, and more importantly, you lose your true strength. You are living not because you want to, but because you are afraid. You worry that if you speak up, you will cause trouble, you won't be accepted, or you will face opposition. But silence is not always safe. Sometimes it is the path to weakness, the loss of freedom and your own power. Silence is not always a wise choice. It can be a tool for victory. But when you remain silent simply because you fear conflict, because you worry about upsetting others, you're walking straight into a trap. In life, if you always keep silent to avoid complicating things, you will become a puppet in the hands of others, with no say, no voice. You will no longer be yourself. You will be a mere shadow of others' expectations and desires. At that point, silence is no longer a weapon of power, but submission. And when you remain silent in situations like this, you are conceding, giving control of your life to others. Don't let silence turn you into someone controlled by others' expectations. Don't let it make you forget your own value, your inner strength. Every time you choose silence out of fear or anxiety about others' reactions, you're surrendering your control. And in doing so, you're not only losing the right to speak, but also losing the ability to live a free life, unbound by others' expectations. Silence must be a choice born from self-control, strength, and resilience. It is not a wordless resistance, but a clear affirmation that you do not need to be subjected to others' influence. Silence is not escape. It is standing firm in your own peace. You have the right to remain silent when you don't want to engage in meaningless conversations, when you don't want to be dragged into unnecessary conflict. But never remain silent because of fear. Never let silence become surrender. Let your silence be a statement of self-assertion, a powerful weapon you use when necessary, not something you do out of fear or worry. If you always remain silent just because you don't want to complicate things, if you remain silent because you fear others won't accept you, then you have unknowingly turned yourself into a weak person, living according to others' expectations. But if you learn to use silence as a tool of self-control, you will no longer be weak. You will be the one who decides when to stay silent and when to speak up. You will be the one who controls the conversation in your own life. This silence will not be submission. It will be power, a power that does not need to speak to be acknowledged. As we wrap up, remember this: true motivation comes not from arguing, but from mastering the art of silence. Just like Denzel Washington has taught us through his quiet strength, sometimes the most powerful move in any relationship is to stay composed and let your presence speak louder than words, whether in personal or professional life. So, take control, stay calm, and allow your silence to do the talking. If you've learned something valuable today, don't forget to subscribe for more insights on how to win in life and relationships without saying a word.